Creativity is, by definition, creating something out of nothing.
If you're an artist, you learn that the thing that you think you're creating is not the thing that you end up creating.
The idea of failure in some ways is saying, I had an idea of what I thought needed to happen or what should happen, and it turned out differently. It's actually not failure at all.
This is what art does. Art gets to the soul, gets to the place where values, where relationships, where meaning is made. It's change, evolve, grow, stretch.
Welcome back. In this episode, Louisa, Jeff, and I are going to discuss transformation. But not transformation from, say, novice into master, but really transformation of our own weaknesses and our wounds into our strengths, our medicine, and our power.
This is arguably one of my favorite subjects, favorite topics. It's a concept or really an archetype that remains the same no matter how many people you're talking about or how few people you're talking about. And it's your wound is your gift. So in this stage of the hero's journey where you've hopefully said yes to the call to adventure, or at least you're on your way there, a part of the discovery, a part of the journey toward really fulfilling your life's mission, discovering why you're here, is that you find the gift in your wound. And the only way there is through, and it's through suffering, because the wound needs to be transformed so that you can create a medicine. And that medicine then can become medicine for others.
We were looking back in our 20s, and we knew each other, but we were in parallel worlds. Obviously, the two of us are married, so we have one story, and you were another town and doing kids and all that, so you have another story. But the commonality was like, it was tough. We had clarity, we had mentors, we had support, and it was brutally tough to make it through the day after day, month after month, year after year, toil and grind of choosing that path among many temptations and fighting our own fears to find that middle balance, like not the grandiosity or the fantasy about the great me, and not giving in to the fear or the self-doubt or the self-hatred, but continuing on that path, which then we said kind of starts a fire boiling. It's like a purifying fire, really, to test you, say, how much really are you willing to serve? How much are you really willing to transform yourself to become capable? And then we talked about it, that in your life, for example, you're reaching this point where you're finding this newfound, you're finding this really solid core of true capability without the fear and without the fantasy. And so what came up in all of that is that the wound is the gift. There is a wound, a problem, a childhood, a trauma, whatever it is, that burdens you. And working through that gives you strength so that you ultimately grow that capability, and then, to your point, can share that with others. And at a certain point, others then start to come to you and ask you, even almost sort of telepathically or intuitively, they sense that you have, as you said, a medicine for them. So now in our 40s, young people coming to us sense that we've suffered through something and they're looking for that direction because they're suffering through that, whatever. So wound as your gift, I always think of it as, my dad drew this little drawing on this little notepad when I was about 12 years old or 13. And he and my mom were getting divorced. And it was a trash can with a little drawing of Texas on the side. And it had a bunch of stuff in it. And there's a little flower coming out of the trash can. It said, "Bloom where you're planted." And at the time, I thought, well, that's kind of like something that you see on one of those dumb office posters. But over the years, it was like, yeah, you got handed a pile of garbage. Yeah, you had trauma in your childhood. Yeah, your parents got divorced. Or yeah, whatever it is. You are wounded, but you endure that and you grow strong because of that. And then you finally, that strength becomes your capability. Without that wound, you wouldn't have the capability. So that's how I think of your wound as your gift.
There is a certain extent to whereby one can find a way to appreciate where we are at the moment we are there.
Okay, so you just reminded me about leaning into the suffering. So if you run away from it, you are putting off what needs to happen. You're putting off a process that's trying to take place, that's trying to teach you something. And one of the things it's trying to teach you, or maybe the most essential thing it's trying to teach you, is about love. Because suffering and love are just two sides of the same coin. And you can't really, I don't think, understand, experience, feel. You cannot be filled with kind of transcendent love if you've not suffered. So the suffering is the teacher of love, and it carves you out and it burns out all this inessential stuff. And one of those inessential things is ego. If so long as you are, you got a little echo chamber going on here, whether it's the great me or it's resentment or it's anger or shame. So long as you have that echo chamber happening where it's all about you can't experience and you can't be a giver of love.
You can't grow through it.
No. So suffering is so important.
But I think we should be clear that we're not condoning inflicting suffering on others, and we're not talking about excusing the kind of gross injustices that cause suffering. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, for example, we have a close friend who, as a teenager, endured a terrible traumatic event that for many years was kind of a dent in her soul. But she took it on. She began to do her inner work and really work with what happened to her, and began in that work to make sense and integrate and move through. And as she's growing up, she is so strong and so clear and a resource for other women. And that's what we're talking about, right? So this terrible thing happened to her, but now that it's happened, how can we make it into something? So we're not condoning the wounding of others and self, but we're saying when there's a wound, and we're all wounded, and there's always going to be a wound, then there's a way of looking at that and of working with it to transmute it into strength and capacity and healing for yourself and others. So I just want to be clear about that, because it might come across as like, oh, well, you guys have never suffered what I've suffered. How can you say that it's a good thing?
Yeah.
Well, that's not what we mean. But when you're given your lot, whatever it is, there is a way for every human. What we've seen, what we've tried to do in ourselves, what we've helped each other do, is transmute that into something. And that's what I'm thinking we're saying.
And we could mention trauma in here, I think, because trauma in the work that I have done in the past with clients who have experienced the most horrific traumatic experiences, whether they're a child or an adult. One of the things that I remember saying to a client once, he was suffering from PTSD, and it wasn't my work to help him heal from his PTSD. I was his business coach, but we were dealing with we were working at dealing with the symptoms that he was every day. It couldn't be something to not talk about, right? Mm-hmm. So it was very much there. And I've worked with him for years. And one time I said to him, look, the healing I don't know how you can heal from trauma if you don't have a spiritual worldview, because you have to understand this wound, and you have to understand it from a spiritual perspective. Otherwise, it makes no sense. and you can never really move on from it.
There's no context for this.
There's
it's just
no
a random,
nothing. It's like if
a random event in an apathetic universe.
Yeah, and ruled by indifferent gods,
Yeah.
right, who do not care.
Right.
And so this is sort of senseless violence of it. And he kind of dismissed it at the time, even though he's a Buddhist and he's a martial artist, like a 3rd-degree black belt. But some months later, he came back around and said, you're right. To make sense. And because if I'd said to him, in your greatest suffering, there is the greatest opportunity, he'd be like, you don't know what you're talking about, right? This is completely senseless.
Walk in my shoes for a little while.
Yeah, and I totally get it. And yet, as an observer of him, I've had the enormous privilege, as any coach does, to kind of be let into the intimacy of the client's world. And what I was seeing was someone who had the most tremendous compassion because he had been through what he'd been through. So he was the pearl. His compassion was the pearl that had to be formed around the sand of his PTSD. So for me, it's like I can see how he had to become an amazing, remarkable human being, and it's going to have a ripple effect in the world around him. Anyway, that's sort of a picture.
No, it's important. And, there was something that in some ways I had to deal with. I'm a white middle-class man from America who lives in California. Like, how much better could it be? There's a bit of that reality, which is that my traumas and my challenges and my suffering is going to be, you can compare it to almost anybody and say, give me a break, right? Yeah. But at the same time, they are mine. And though they may be much less than others might be from a completely objective point of view, they are wound for me.
I think the key word there is acknowledgement. So when you acknowledge that you've suffered, that has an amazing power to release you. We call that, in Magenta, naming the wound. So when you name it, and you give it its precise name, I'm not talking about like a word, like, whatever. It's like you understand it in to a pretty granular level. You really understand the wound in its whole form, and you're giving it its name. It's like a mythical thing, and there's actually a fairy tale, Rumpelstiltskin. You remember that one?
Yeah.
It's all about the little elf gnome creature who wants to take the baby of the queen away as payment for helping her become queen. And she is so horrified at giving up her newborn baby, she begs and cries, and he relents and says, all right, well, if you guess my name, you get to keep the baby. And she does. She guesses his name, and she gets to keep the baby. That is an analog or a picture of this
archetype.
Yeah,
Of
for
what
the soul.
we're talking about, right?
An
Which
archetype
is
for the soul,
yeah, naming
the wound.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the wound and the vulnerability that comes with examining the wound and, in a Boycean sense, revealing the wound. Boyce has this piece called Show Your Wound. And Psych Deine Wunde was and it was all about, to your earlier point, at any scale, whether you're talking about the individual or the family or the community or the nation, to reveal the wound. In his case, it was the wound of Nazi Germany, that the Germans had to admit that their country had done this thing, which it took a generation to do. And I think in America, there's all kinds of wounds that we don't admit and don't reveal.
Yeah.
We don't talk about the colonial atrocities with the Native Americans.
Genocide.
Yeah. And we don't, we talk about slavery, but we're not willing to talk about reparations.
And we're not willing to apologize to
Right.
anyone.
And so these wounds hang over us and ripple from generation to generation, not in some kind of abstract way, just as like this narrative, but in a real felt sense that we can see around us. We are, as American culture, disconnected from the land in the way that the natives were not. And so our disconnection that began in the colonial days persists to this day, in that we pillage our natural resources and create horrendously ugly landscapes. And the treatment of African Americans in this country is another such wound that, yes, we're making steps, but come on, we're not really admitting and going into it and revealing it. And that comes out not only in national politics, but in the schoolyard, in the street, in the grocery store. So that's what I was thinking of. And I was also thinking about just my own life with my own wounds, which, were severe. They were intense. And they took a long time for me to make sense of and integrate.
We have a cat joining us.
Yes, we do. Ebony, what do you have to say about it? I think a lot of my the prolongedness of my suffering, and I'm saying this because I would like to help shorten other people's journey through suffering, was denial of the wound, maybe you could say. And it's okay, because maybe I wasn't strong enough to face what I needed to face in terms of the sexual assault and the chauvinism in my country, where I grew up in New Zealand. And what was around me in terms of many women in my family being assaulted, and what that did to me in terms of my relationship to my own sexuality and so forth. It took a long time for me to be ready to really face that wound. So on one hand, we're saying, go into the wound, lean into it, don't allow it to fester. But on the other hand, let's acknowledge that you have a dark and you have a light. You have a shadow and you have a light. And in order to see into your wound, in order to see into your shadow and into your darkness, make sure your light is strong enough. Make sure that you have some structure in your soul that you can do it.
Well, that's been a totally crucial part of our journey. And when we talk about the importance of meeting our mentors, for example, Dennis, I began inner work practice
What do you mean
20 years ago, 25 years ago. I think at the beginning of that journey of addressing the wound and acknowledging it, before one gets there, one starts to see the effects of the wound around one, right? So some people, when you have a wound, then the wound can be triggered by something that someone does or says, or something that happens to you. And when that trigger happens, there is a reaction in you. And that reaction ranges all over the scale, right? Some people shut down and withdraw. Other people explode. Some get irritated. Some get resentful. Some get vengeful. And it's all kind of a childhood patterning of what did you learn? What did you see? What was imprinted on you? And you develop that coping mechanism, so to speak. So when in your 20s, for example, or 30s, whenever it happens to you, you start to see that your reactions are really loud or really visible or really limiting your creative work or your forward progress or your relationship. You go, oh, I'm doing something here. It's not just the other person's fault, right? So if you're in a relationship that totally blows up, you can blame that other person because they're an ass, right? But if you're in a second relationship that blows up pretty much along the same lines, it gets harder to blame the other person. And if it happens again and you're still not starting to look at yourself, then you're willfully blind.
You're
right?
the ass.
Yeah. So it's like, what does it take for you to see that you're implicated in this dysfunction? in your life. So at that point, inner work becomes necessary. And by that, I mean what you said. You start looking at your shadow and really trying to understand it. And it could be journaling and therapy and counseling and study. And wow, okay, this is what happened to me. These are my trigger points. This is how I react. These are some of the behaviors that I act towards others. These are some of the things that I do in myself, the voices in myself, the things that I tell myself. Well, that's an analysis that helps you get to know your shadow, right? And then to have the strength to begin to inhibit those habits and those reactions, there's some light strengthening, as you called it, Louisa, some capability building to interfere in those patterns, right? So for us, that was beginning meditation 25 years ago. The daily practice of sitting in silence builds a capacity to rest and be poised between stimulus and response. So that when you're in a situation where you are triggered, there's some hope that you don't just automatically respond. And meditation for us has been linked to that we every day structure that silence so that in the waking hours and the busy hustle, we have a drop of that silence in us. And when something triggers us, we can say, whoa, I'm reacting now, not going to react. And we do what's called turn the soul, kind of reorient to this moment. And then out of nonviolent communication or other tools, ask a question, re-engage, not from your place of woundedness and irritation and projection on the other person, but from a place of a little bit more presence. So that's how we structure our inner work in our family and in our business, and what our coaching and teaching is it's a two-sided, two-stepping, left foot, right foot thing.
Yeah.
Transforming the wound and strengthening the capacity, or transforming the shadow and strengthening the light.
Yeah, and just a bit of a finer point on strengthening the light. Like I said earlier, staring into the shadow for too long can be kind of dangerous. So it's not like we're advising everyone to just stare into that wound and with nothing to help them, right? So really wanting to caution, I mean, I do with my clients, to say we need to develop a practice. And a practice to us as artists mean it's something that you do every day, and it's rhythmical. So rhythm is it's a healing, potentizing force. You can do just a little tiny bit of something, but if you do it every day and you do it at the same time every day and it has this kind of rhythm, it builds a potentizing force in your soul, and that force is a healing force. So that's why meditation, for me, has been the thing that allows me to be able to pause between stimulus and response. And it's something that has only built up slowly over time because of rhythm. It's not something, sometimes, you can experience a big difference when you first start, like something like a meditative practice, and sometimes it takes time. It took time from me. But now I never miss a day. Like, it doesn't happen. If I do, it would be because there was some emergency, because I would not make it through the day. I depend upon it that much to give me equanimity, to help me face the day and the storms of my emotions throughout the day, with greater peace. And I think I just want to give a picture about where one is going with something like inner work, inner development, healing. And that is, if you imagine someone who is like an initiate, someone who has done that work and has come to a point of enlightenment, maybe you could say, what would their soul look like, right? And I imagine this crystalline structure, this highly, highly structured, like you could find such structures in nature, the intricate structure of water or a spider's web or an ancient tree or whatever, right? There's this order and rhythm and structure to it. But it's so dynamic and it's so in flow with the natural forces, the lawfulness, but it's structured. And this is the key. You see, where there's chaos, there's not an intelligence. So the healing process, what it actually does, is it helps to begin to put order and structure into your soul. And that is the foundation upon which you stand.
In my experience, inner work is messy work. It's hard work. I needed to make art, I needed to write, I needed a lot of client experience, I needed a lot of relationships that went wrong, I needed you and my kids being a mirror for me. I needed the physical work of being in my body and building and doing things. It's not something that I could sit down and figure out in an afternoon.
Yeah.
It was years and years and years of peeling the onion and getting down and down and down and down. And I think what happened over those years was I got to know myself and you got to know me. And we would have these conversations that, okay, so to give a picture, if I did something that triggered you and you got angry, you would shut me out. And if you did something that triggered me, I would explode and get irritated. And we would like stop talking for a day or be upset for maybe, and like in the early part of our marriage, it was 2 or 3, 4 days.
Yeah, it took us a long time.
Especially you.
Oh, yeah?
Come on. I hung out with you guys enough.
Yeah.
Come on, at least 50-50. Come on.
I think I would, to be fair, I would react more explosively.
Oh, yeah, but you would get over it
But I would get over it sooner.
Oh, yeah, I could hold a grudge.
And you would fester for days.
Yep.
Okay. So regardless of blame, it was yin and yang.
Yeah.
The perfect counterpart for each other. And what happened was through the dialogue, and because we were given these tools and we learned them from others that we teach now, we use those tools to grow stronger together.
Yeah.
So there was a rupture, but then when we'd grow back together, it would be a little bit stronger. And then there would be a rupture and it would be a little bit stronger. And over the years, we began to see that instead of 4 days to kind of grow back together and feel the intimacy and the closeness and the trust, it would take 1 day. And we'd get it. And now, we get it down to sometimes if we have a reaction, we can turn it around in minutes. There's no collateral damage. So at first, to give a picture, it was like we're walking along and then there's something happen and then we fall off the edge, down the cliff, big dust, avalanche, disaster, tears. Oh my God, right? And then over time, it was like we fall and then, no, let's not fall. We know that one. Let's don't go there. Climb back up on our road. And then over time, it was like, stop it. Oh yeah, I'm doing my thing again. Sorry. No problem. To the point where, now we don't have those blow-ups. We don't fall down that mountain into crumbles. We course correct quickly. And one more thing. I think now is to the point we know our dynamics, we know our trigger points so well that before they happen, we can look at that road and say, oh yeah, what are we going to do as we walk down this road, as we do this day, as we do this client project, as we go into this meeting? What are we going to do? How are we showing up so that we don't trigger each other? And then if there's any slight tremors in a meeting or in whatever we're doing, we both inwardly course correct so we don't trigger each other. So I call that growing capable, because we are now growing a new capability that we didn't have 20 years ago. But that took time. That is not an intellectual exercise. No. It is a practice of learning that terrain and gradually working it out so that you're no longer triggered, and when you are, you can course correct quickly.
Yeah.